The security footage would later show exactly 17 seconds. 17 seconds of what appeared to be typical high school bullying books scattered across linoleum floors, papers floating through fluorescent-lit hallways, and a small figure in a blue sweater picking up the pieces. But those 17 seconds would trigger a federal investigation that would shake Riverside High School to its very foundation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison Torres had learned to read lips before she could properly tie her shoes. Born profoundly deaf, she navigated the world through a complex dance of visual cues, hand movements, and the subtle vibrations that most people never noticed. At 17, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible, a survival skill she developed over years of attending mainstream schools where being different often meant being a target. Riverside High School in suburban Connecticut was supposed to be different. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Brennan, had personally assured Madison's parents that the school had excellent accommodations for hearing-impaired students. They had interpreters, note-taking services, and even a small community of other deaf and hard-of-hearing students. What Mrs. Brennan hadn't mentioned was that none of these resources could protect Madison from the social dynamics that plagued every high school corridor. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Madison arrived at school 20 minutes early, as was her routine. She preferred the quiet emptiness of the hallways before the chaos of 800 teenagers descended upon them. Her backpack, a worn navy blue JanSport that had survived 3 years of high school, contained the usual academic arsenal: textbooks for advanced placement chemistry, calculus, and American literature, along with a specialized tablet she used for communication with hearing classmates. But tucked discreetly into the front pocket was something new, a device no bigger than a button, connected wirelessly to a sophisticated recording system her older brother Jake had helped her install. Jake, a cybersecurity specialist working for a government contractor, had grown increasingly concerned about the stories Madison shared about her school experiences. The bruised textbooks, the accidentally dropped assignments, the invisible wall of exclusion that seemed to follow her through every academic year. "It's just documentation," Jake had explained to their parents, Michael and Sandra Torres, during a heated family discussion the previous weekend. "If something serious happens, we need evidence. The school system protects itself first, students second." Their mother had objected initially. Sandra Torres, a nurse at Hartford Hospital, believed in working through proper channels, talking to teachers, meeting with administrators, following the established protocols. But after 3 separate incidents in the past month where Madison's belongings had been mysteriously damaged or destroyed, even Sandra was beginning to question whether the traditional approach was sufficient. The first incident involved Madison's chemistry lab notebook, which she'd spent weeks perfecting with detailed diagrams and calculations. She'd found it in the parking lot after school, pages scattered and torn, her careful illustrations ruined by what appeared to be deliberate destruction. When she reported it to her chemistry teacher, Mr. Gonzalez, he'd simply shrugged and suggested she be more careful with her belongings. The second incident was more direct. During the lunch period, Madison had been sitting alone at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, working on homework while eating a sandwich her mother had packed. 3 girls from her American literature class, Brittany Walsh, Jessica Chun, and their apparent leader, Ashley Morrison, had approached her table. Ashley, a senior with perfectly straightened blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed family money, had made exaggerated hand gestures that were clearly meant to mock sign language, while her friends giggled and recorded the performance on their phones. Madison had simply gathered her things and moved to another table, but the humiliation burned in her chest for days afterward. When she tried to report the incident to the vice principal, Mr. Henderson, she was told that without witnesses willing to come forward, There was little the school could do about misunderstandings between students. The third incident had crossed a line that even Madison's diplomatic nature couldn't excuse. Someone had broken into her locker. The combination lock was intact, suggesting inside knowledge, and vandalized her personal belongings. Her favorite photograph of her family from their vacation to Yellowstone National Park had been torn in half. Her emergency hearing aid batteries, which cost nearly $200 to replace, had been scattered and crushed. Most disturbingly, someone had written "freak" across her ASL dictionary in permanent marker. It was after this incident that Jake had insisted on the recording device. "The system is failing you," he'd told Madison during one of their late-night conversations in the family kitchen. "Sometimes you have to create your own justice." Madison understood her brother's frustration, but she also understood something. He didn't. The delicate ecosystem of high school social hierarchies. Drawing attention to herself, fighting back too aggressively, could make her situation exponentially worse. She'd seen it happen to other students who tried to stand up to the popular crowd. The retaliation was swift and merciless, but she also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. The incidents were escalating, becoming more personal and more cruel. Ashley Morrison and her group seemed to view tormenting Madison as entertainment, a way to demonstrate their social power to their peers. And the adults in charge seemed either unwilling or unable to intervene effectively. So Madison had agreed to the recording device, with one crucial modification that Jake didn't know about. While he thought she was simply documenting potential harassment for future complaints to school authorities, Madison had connected the device to something far more sophisticated, a direct communication system that could instantly alert emergency services if she found herself in genuine danger. Her ASL interpreter from middle school, David Kim, had helped her develop a series of specific hand signals that could trigger different types of emergency responses. David, who was now studying criminal justice at the University of Connecticut, had friends in law enforcement who understood that deaf individuals often faced unique challenges in emergency situations. They'd created a system where Madison could silently call for help if a situation became genuinely threatening. The irony wasn't lost on Madison that she was essentially preparing for war in what should have been a safe learning environment. She'd worked harder than most of her classmates to earn her place in advanced courses, maintained a 3.8 GPA, despite the additional challenges of processing information in a language she couldn't hear, and had never caused trouble for anyone. Yet here she was, carrying recording equipment and emergency communication devices to protect herself from her own peers. As she walked through the empty hallways that Tuesday morning, Madison reflected on how different her high school experience might have been in a different time or place. She'd read about deaf communities where sign language was celebrated rather than mocked, where being different was viewed as valuable rather than threatening. But Riverside High School was not that place, and Madison had learned to adapt to the environment she was given rather than the one she wished she had. The morning bell rang, a sound she felt as vibrations through the floor rather than heard. The peaceful corridors began filling with the chaos of teenage energy. Madison made her way to her first period advanced placement chemistry class, unaware that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become the catalyst for extraordinary events that would reshape not just her own life, but the entire culture of Riverside High School. The chemistry lab buzzed with the energy of 17 students preparing for their weekly practical examination. Madison had claimed her usual spot at the back corner table, where she could observe the entire room while working. Her lab partner, Kevin Rodriguez, was one of the few students who had made genuine efforts to communicate with her, learning basic fingerspelling and always ensuring she could see his lips when he spoke. "Ready for the titration challenge?" Kevin asked, positioning himself so Madison could read his lips clearly. She nodded and gave him a thumbs up, pulling out her meticulously organized lab notebook. Every procedure was written in her precise handwriting, with detailed diagrams she'd drawn to supplement the standard instructions. Mr. Gonzalez began explaining the day's experiment, and Madison focused intently on the interpreter who had arrived. Just as class started, Mrs. Sarah Coleman was new to the district, having recently moved from a school in Massachusetts that had a larger deaf student population. Unlike some interpreters who seemed to view their role as simply translating words, Mrs. Coleman understood the importance of conveying tone, emphasis, and context. The experiment involved determining the concentration of an unknown acid solution through careful measurement and calculation. Madison had always excelled in chemistry because it relied on visual observation, precise measurement, and logical analysis skills that didn't require hearing. She and Kevin worked efficiently, documenting each step with the thoroughness that had earned them an A average in the class. As they waited for their solution to reach the proper color change, Madison noticed commotion at the front of the classroom. Ashley Morrison and her lab partner, Brittany Walsh, appeared to be having difficulty with their equipment. Ashley's voice carried across the room, not that Madison could hear it, but she could see the theatrical gestures and the way other students turned to look. What Madison could observe clearly was Ashley's body language and facial expressions. The frustration seemed exaggerated, performed rather than genuine. Ashley kept glancing toward Madison's table while speaking to Mr. Gonzalez, and Madison recognized the pattern she'd observed many times before. Ashley was setting up some kind of scenario. Mrs. Coleman discreetly signed to Madison that Ashley was complaining about her equipment being sabotaged and suggesting that someone might have tampered with her chemicals. The accusation was absurd. Students didn't have access to each other's materials, and Madison had been focused entirely on her own work. But Madison also understood that logic often took a backseat to drama in Ashley's world. Mr. Gonzalez handled the situation professionally, providing Ashley and Brittany with new equipment and allowing them extra time to complete their work. But Madison noticed Ashley's expression as she returned to her station. This wasn't over. The class period proceeded normally until the final 15 minutes, when students were supposed to clean their stations and submit their completed lab reports. Madison and Kevin had finished early, as usual, and were carefully washing their glassware when the incident began. Ashley approached their station, ostensibly to use the sink next to theirs. She carried her lab materials in a plastic tray, walking with the kind of deliberate casualness that Madison had learned to recognize as dangerous. Brittany and Jessica followed a few steps behind, positioning themselves to create a small crowd around the sink area. Madison was rinsing a graduated cylinder when she noticed Ashley moving closer, her tray tilted at an angle that would make spilling inevitable. The next few seconds unfolded with the slow-motion clarity that often accompanies moments of crisis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ashley stumbled forward, her tray flying toward Madison's workspace. The contents including a beaker of the acid solution they'd been working with, splashed across Madison's lab notebook and onto her clothes. Madison jumped back instinctively, but not quickly enough to avoid getting the solution on her sweater and hands. The acid wasn't concentrated enough to cause serious burns, but it immediately began eating through the fabric of her sweater and stinging her skin. More devastating was the damage to her lab notebook. Weeks of careful work dissolving before her eyes as the acid reacted with the paper and ink. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Ashley exclaimed, her voice loud enough to draw attention from across the room. "I'm so clumsy. Let me help you clean that up." But Madison could see the brief smile that flickered across Ashley's face before she began her performance of concern and helpfulness. This wasn't an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated attack designed to look like an unfortunate mishap. Kevin immediately moved to help Madison, grabbing paper towels and guiding her toward the emergency eye wash station. Mrs. Coleman rushed over, signing rapidly to ask if Madison was hurt and needed medical attention. Mr. Gonzalez appeared moments later, assessing the situation with the practiced efficiency of a teacher who had dealt with lab accidents before. "Everyone step back, please," Mr. Gonzalez instructed. "Madison, are you experiencing any burning or pain on your skin?" Madison nodded and pointed to her hands, where red marks were beginning to appear. Mr. Gonzalez immediately activated the emergency wash station and helped her rinse the affected areas. The water was cold and harsh, but it stopped the burning sensation. While Mr. Gonzalez attended to Madison's immediate medical needs, Ashley continued her performance for the growing audience of classmates. "I feel terrible," she announced. "I was carrying too much at once, and I just lost my balance. These sinks are so close together, and with everyone trying to clean up at the same time." Her explanation sounded reasonable to anyone who hadn't observed the careful choreography that preceded the accident. But Madison had seen it all, and more importantly, her hidden recording device had captured everything. Mrs. Coleman stayed close to Madison throughout the cleanup process, signing reassurances and asking detailed questions about her physical condition. When Madison indicated that her hands were feeling better but her notebook was destroyed, Mrs. Coleman's expression darkened with understanding. "This was your semester project notebook?" she signed. Madison nodded, looking at the soggy, disintegrating pages that represented hours of careful work. The timing was particularly cruel. Their major lab practical was scheduled for the following week, and Madison's notebook contained all the reference material she would need to prepare. Mr. Gonzalez documented the incident on an official accident report, noting the chemical exposure and the damaged materials. He assured Madison that she wouldn't be penalized for the destroyed notebook, and that he would provide her with copies of any material she needed to recreate her work. But they both knew that weeks of original observations, calculations, and personal notes couldn't simply be replaced. As the class period ended, Ashley made a point of approaching Madison again. "I really am sorry," she said, speaking slowly and clearly so Madison could read her lips. "Maybe I can help you recreate some of your notes? I know how hard you work on everything." The offer was made loudly enough for Mr. Gonzalez and several other students to hear another performance designed to make Ashley appear considerate and helpful. But Madison could see the cold satisfaction in Ashley's eyes, the barely contained smirk that revealed her true feelings about the situation. Madison simply nodded politely and gathered her remaining belongings. She had learned long ago that responding to Ashley's provocations only escalated situations and drew unwanted attention. But as she left the chemistry lab, her damaged notebook dripping acid solution onto the hallway floor, Madison felt something shift inside her. The recording device in her backpack had captured everything, not just the incident itself, but the careful setup, the coordinated positioning of Ashley's friends, and the theatrical performance that followed. For the first time since the harassment began, Madison had concrete evidence of what was really happening. But more than that, she had reached a tipping point in her tolerance for being treated as a target. The destruction of her notebook wasn't just an attack on her property, it was an attack on weeks of hard work, on her academic success, on her right to learn in a safe environment. As Madison walked toward her next class, her hands still stinging from the acid exposure, she began formulating a plan that would make Ashley, Morrison and her friends understand that deaf didn't mean defenseless. The nurse's office at Riverside High School had seen its share of teenage drama, but Nurse Jennifer Murphy recognized something different in Madison Torres when she arrived with chemical burns on her hands and acid-damaged clothing. The 17-year-old sat quietly on the examination table while Murphy cleaned and treated the affected areas. But there was a tension in her posture that spoke to deeper issues than a simple lab accident. "These burns aren't severe, but they're going to be tender for a few days," Murphy explained, making sure Madison could see her lips clearly. She applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped Madison's hands in light gauze. I need to document this as a chemical exposure incident, which means I'll have to file a report with the administration. Madison nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The recording device in her backpack had captured everything, but she wasn't sure how to use the evidence without revealing the surveillance system her brother had helped her install. The school had strict policies about recording other students without consent, and Madison didn't want to create additional problems for herself. Mrs. Coleman, the Azel interpreter, had accompanied Madison to the nurse's office and remained throughout the treatment. She'd worked in schools long enough to recognize the signs of systematic harassment, and what she'd observed in the chemistry lab troubled her deeply. "Madison," Mrs. Coleman signed discreetly, "have there been other incidents like this one?" The question opened a floodgate Madison hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Through a combination of sign language and written notes, she described the pattern of harassment she'd endured over the past several months. The destroyed belongings, the public humiliation, the escalating aggression that had culminated in today's chemical attack. Mrs. Coleman's expression grew increasingly serious as the story unfolded. She'd worked with deaf students in several districts, and she understood how their unique communication needs could make them particularly vulnerable to certain types of bullying. The isolation that came with being one of the few deaf students in a mainstream school created opportunities for harassment that hearing students rarely faced. "This needs to be reported properly," Mrs. Coleman signed. "Not just as an accident, but as part of a pattern of targeted harassment." Madison hesitated. Previous attempts to work through official channels had yielded minimal results, and she was reluctant to subject herself to another round of meetings where adults made sympathetic noises but took no meaningful action. However, Mrs. Coleman's presence changed the dynamic. Having an adult witness who could communicate fluently in ASL meant Madison's concerns couldn't be dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. While Madison finished her treatment with Nurse Murphy, Mrs. Coleman made a series of phone calls that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could have anticipated. Her first call was to the district's special education coordinator, Dr. Angela Martinez, who oversaw services for students with disabilities across all schools in the district. Dr. Martinez had been expecting this call. She'd received 3 separate reports over the past month about potential harassment of deaf and hard of hearing students at Riverside High, but the incidents had been reported through different channels and hadn't been connected until now. A parent complained about damaged hearing aid equipment, a counselor's concern about a student's declining academic performance, and now a chemical exposure incident that appeared to be anything but accidental. "I'm driving over now," Dr. Martinez told Mrs. Coleman. "Don't let Madison leave the building until we've had a chance to meet with the administration. If this is what I think it is, we need to document everything properly." Mrs. Coleman's second call was to Madison's parents. Sandra Torres answered the phone at Hartford Hospital, where she was working a double shift in the cardiac unit. The news that her daughter had been injured at school sent ice through her veins, but Mrs. Coleman's calm professionalism helped her understand that Madison's physical injuries were minor compared to the broader implications of what had happened. "I'm leaving work now," Sandra said. "Michael is at a job site in Waterbury, but I'll call him on the way. We'll be there within an hour." The third call Mrs. Coleman made was one that Madison didn't know about. She contacted Detective Lisa Park of the Connecticut State Police, who specialized in cases involving harassment and threats against individuals with disabilities. Detective Park had worked with Mrs. Coleman on several previous cases where school-based harassment had escalated to criminal behavior. Detective Park listened carefully to Mrs. Coleman's description of the incident and the pattern of behavior leading up to it. What caught her attention wasn't just the escalating nature of the harassment, but the sophisticated way it had been carried out, always with plausible deniability, always in situations where the perpetrators could claim innocence. "This sounds like organized harassment," Detective Park said. The kind of thing that doesn't happen spontaneously. Someone is planning these incidents, which suggests they may have discussed them in advance through text messages, social media, or other digital communications. The legal implications were significant. If the harassment could be proven to be coordinated and targeting Madison specifically because of her disability, it would constitute a federal hate crime under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The chemical incident, if proven to be intentional, could result in assault charges. While these calls were being made, Madison sat in the nurse's office trying to process what had happened and what might come next. She pulled out her phone and typed a careful message to her brother Jake, who was working at his cybersecurity firm in Hartford. Had an incident at school today. Someone accidentally spilled acid on me in the chemistry lab. I'm okay, but my notebook is destroyed and my hands are burned. The recording device got everything. What should I do? Jake's response came back. Within minutes, do not delete anything from the device. Do not tell anyone about the recording yet. I'm contacting our legal consultant now. Are Mom and Dad aware? Madison confirmed that their parents had been notified and were on their way to the school. Jake's next message was more detailed. I've been documenting the harassment pattern based on what you've told me. If this was intentional, it could be classified as a federal offense. The recording might be crucial evidence, but we need to handle it correctly. Don't mention it to school officials until we talk to a lawyer. The legal complexity of the situation was something Madison hadn't fully considered. The recording device that was meant to protect her might actually create complications if not handled properly. Connecticut had specific laws about recording conversations without consent, and using the evidence inappropriately could potentially damage any case they might want to build. Dr. Martinez arrived at Riverside High School 45 minutes after Mrs. Coleman's call, carrying a thick folder of documentation and a determination to finally address what appeared to be a systematic failure to protect vulnerable students. She found Madison still in the nurse's office, now accompanied by both parents who had arrived within minutes of each other despite coming from different parts of the county. Michael Torres, still wearing his construction work clothes, looked like he wanted to punch someone. Sandra Torres, in her hospital scrubs, was focused on examining her daughter's injuries and asking detailed medical questions. Both parents were struggling with the realization that their daughter had been suffering harassment for months without them fully understanding the severity of the situation. We need to meet with Principal Stevens immediately, Dr. Martinez announced. This incident appears to be part of a pattern of disability-based harassment that the school has failed to address adequately. Principal Robert Stevens was not having a good day. The chemical incident report had already reached his desk along with a note from Mr. Gonzalez expressing concerns about the suspicious circumstances surrounding the accident. Now he was facing a room full of angry adults demanding explanations for his school's handling of harassment complaints. Dr. Martinez presented her documentation methodically. The pattern of incidents targeting Madison and other deaf students in the district. The inadequate responses from school officials when complaints were filed. The escalating nature of the harassment that had now resulted in physical injury to a student. This represents a systemic failure to provide a safe educational environment for students with disabilities, Dr. Martinez stated. Under federal law, the school district has specific obligations to protect these students from harassment and discrimination. Principal Stevens found himself caught between competing pressures. The parents of the alleged perpetrators were influential. Community members who had already made their expectations clear, their daughters were not to be unfairly targeted or punished based on unsubstantiated accusations. But now he was facing the possibility of federal oversight and potential legal action if the harassment allegations proved true. We take all harassment complaints seriously, Stevens said, falling back on the standard administrative response. However, we need concrete evidence before we can take disciplinary action against students. Accidents happen in chemistry labs, and we can't assume malicious intent without proof. It was at this moment that Madison made a decision that would change everything. She looked at her parents, at Mrs. Coleman, at Dr. Martinez, and at Principal Stevens, then pulled out her phone and typed a message that she showed to the room. "I have proof." The silence in Principal Stevens' office was deafening, even by Madison's standards. 6 adults stared at the 17-year-old girl, who had just claimed to possess evidence that could unravel weeks of careful administrative damage control. Stevens felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications of what Madison might have recorded. "What kind of proof?" Dr. Martinez asked, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had been fighting bureaucratic battles for years. Madison's fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, typing a response that would forever alter the trajectory of everyone in that room. She held up the device so all could see. "I've been recording everything for weeks. Today's incident was captured on video with audio. So were the previous harassment episodes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Principal Stevens immediately understood the legal minefield he was now navigating. If Madison had recorded other students without their knowledge, the school faced potential lawsuits from multiple families. But if those recordings proved systematic harassment, the school faced federal civil rights violations that could result in the loss of funding and potential criminal charges. "Madison," Stevens said carefully, "recording other students without their consent violates school policy and potentially state law. We need to understand exactly what you've documented and how before we proceed." Sandra Torres, still in her hospital scrubs from her rushed departure from work, stood up with the protective fury that only mothers can summon. "My daughter has been assaulted, harassed, and traumatized for months, while this school did nothing meaningful to protect her. Now you're concerned about policy violations?" Michael Torres placed a calming hand on his wife's shoulder, but his voice carried the same steel when he spoke. "We want to see this evidence, all of it. And we want to understand why our daughter felt she needed to protect herself when the adults here failed to do their jobs." Mrs. Coleman had been quietly signing the conversation to Madison, but now she stepped forward with her own concerns. "Before any recordings are reviewed, we need to consider Madison's rights as a student with disabilities. She has the right to educational accommodations, which includes the right to document harassment when the school system fails to provide adequate protection." Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. Under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, students with disabilities have specific rights regarding documentation of harassment and discrimination. Madison's use of recording devices could be considered a reasonable accommodation, given the school's failure to address previous complaints. Principal Stevens realized he was losing control of the situation rapidly. He made a decision that would prove to be a critical mistake. "I need to contact the school district's legal counsel before we review any recordings. This situation has significant legal implications that require professional guidance." "Absolutely not," Sandra Torres responded immediately. "My daughter was injured today. She's been harassed for months. We're reviewing this evidence now, with or without your cooperation." Jake Torres chose that moment to arrive at the school, having left his cybersecurity firm the moment he received Madison's text about having proof. He appeared in the doorway of the principal's office wearing a business suit and carrying a laptop bag, looking every inch the technology professional he was. "I'm Jake Torres, Madison's brother and her technical advisor," he announced. "I understand there are questions about digital evidence my sister has collected." Principal Stevens looked at the growing crowd in his office and made another decision that would haunt him later. "This meeting is getting out of hand. I'm going to have to ask everyone except Madison and her parents to leave while we sort this." Out internally, Dr. Martinez stood her ground. "As the district's special education coordinator, I have a legal obligation to be present when disability-related harassment is being discussed. I'm not leaving." Jake Torres pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm documenting this meeting and the school's attempts to exclude Madison's support team. This could be construed as additional harassment of a student with disabilities." The situation was spiraling beyond Principal Stevens' ability to manage, but what happened next would transform it from a school disciplinary matter into a federal investigation. Madison had been watching the adults argue about her evidence without including her in the discussion. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a meeting supposedly about her rights, she was once again being marginalized and spoken about rather than spoken to. She made a decision that demonstrated the same courage that had carried her through months of harassment. She pulled out her tablet, connected it to the room's smartboard display system, and began playing the recordings. The first video showed Ashley Morrison and her friends in the cafeteria 3 weeks earlier, making exaggerated and mocking gestures that were clearly meant to ridicule sign language. The audio captured their laughter and comments about the deaf freak who talks with her hands like an animal. The cruelty in their voices was unmistakable. Principal Stevens watched in horror as his students, children he'd known since they were freshmen, revealed themselves to be calculating and malicious in ways he'd never imagined. But what disturbed him more was the background of the video, which showed other students and even a teacher who witnessed the harassment and did nothing to intervene. The second video was more damaging. It showed Jessica Chun deliberately knocking Madison's books out of her hands in the hallway, then pretending to help while actually scattering the papers further. The audio caught Jessica saying to a friend, "Watch this, it's hilarious how she can't even hear me calling her names." But it was the third video that changed everything. Recorded just 2 days before the chemistry incident, it showed Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica in what appeared to be an empty classroom, planning their attack on Madison's lab work. Ashley's voice was clear and unmistakable. "If we mess with her chemicals during the lab, we can make it look like an accident. She'd never be able to prove it was intentional." The room fell completely silent as the implications of the recordings sank in. This wasn't just harassment, it was premeditated assault with chemical weapons. The girls had planned to cause Madison physical harm and had discussed how to avoid responsibility for their actions. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. "This constitutes criminal assault and conspiracy. Principal Stevens, you need to contact law enforcement immediately." Stevens' face had gone pale. "I need to verify the authenticity of these recordings before taking any action." Jake Torres stepped forward with professional confidence. "I can provide complete technical documentation of the recording system, including timestamps, metadata, and chain of custody information. These recordings are authentic and legally admissible." But Madison wasn't finished. She accessed another file on her tablet, this one showing a text message thread between Ashley and her friends that Jake had helped her recover from a backup of Ashley's phone. The messages detailed not just their plans to harm Madison, but their discussions about targeting other students with disabilities at the school. "There are more victims," Mrs. Coleman signed to Madison, who nodded gravely. The text messages revealed a systematic campaign of harassment targeting 3 other students with various disabilities. Ashley's group had been sharing strategies for tormenting students they saw as easy targets, comparing notes on what types of harassment were most effective and least likely to result in punishment. Sandra Torres was shaking with rage as she read the messages over her daughter's shoulder. "These children are sociopaths. They've been torturing vulnerable students for entertainment." Michael Torres had his phone out and was already dialing, "I'm calling the police. This is beyond the school's authority to handle." Principal Stevens realized his worst nightmare was unfolding. Within hours, his school would be crawling with law enforcement investigators, federal agents, and media attention that would destroy both his career and the school's reputation. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his failure to act on earlier complaints had enabled a group of students to escalate their harassment to the point of planned physical assault. But Madison had one more revelation that would ensure this story reached far beyond the borders of Riverside High School. She accessed a final file on her tablet, a compilation video that Jake had helped her create, showing the complete pattern of harassment over several months. Set to a timeline that demonstrated the escalating nature of the attacks, the video was professionally edited with clear timestamps, subtitles for accessibility, and context that made the systematic nature of the harassment undeniable. Jake had prepared it not just as evidence for school officials, but as documentation that could be shared with law enforcement, civil rights organizations, and if necessary, the media. "This isn't just about Madison anymore," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "This is about every vulnerable student in this district and how we protect them. This evidence changes everything." As if summoned by her words, Detective Lisa Park appeared in the doorway of the principal's office, badge visible on her belt and serious expression on her face. Mrs. Coleman's earlier call had prompted an immediate response from the Connecticut State Police unit that specializes in disability-based hate crimes. "I understand there's been a chemical assault on a student with disabilities," Detective Park said. "I'm here to begin a formal investigation." Detective Lisa Park's arrival transformed Principal Stevens' office from a heated parent conference into a crime scene investigation. The veteran investigator had worked dozens of cases involving harassment and assault targeting individuals with disabilities, but the sophistication of the evidence Madison had compiled impressed even her experienced eye. "I need everyone except the victim and her immediate family to step outside while I conduct preliminary interviews," Detective Park announced, establishing control of the situation with quiet authority. Dr. Martinez started to object, but Detective Park raised a hand. "Doctor, I understand your role here, and I'll need to speak with you separately about the school district's response to previous complaints. Mrs. Coleman, your interpretation services will be essential throughout this investigation. Mr. Stevens, I'll need you to secure all administrative records related to these students immediately." As the room cleared, Detective Park established a digital recording system that would capture both spoken conversation and Mrs. Coleman's sign language interpretation. This dual documentation would ensure that Madison's testimony couldn't be misunderstood or misrepresented later. "Madison," Detective Park began, positioning herself where the teenager could easily read her lips, "I specialize in cases where people with disabilities are targeted for harassment or violence. I want you to understand that what happened to you today appears to be a federal crime, not just a school discipline issue." The distinction was important. While school officials could impose suspensions or expulsions, federal hate crimes carried potential prison sentences and permanent criminal records for the perpetrators. More significantly, federal involvement meant resources and authority that local school districts couldn't ignore or deflect. Detective Park reviewed Madison's video evidence with the methodical attention of someone who understood its legal significance. Each recording was time-stamped, logged, and analyzed not just for content, but for admissibility in federal court. The text messages that Jake had recovered would require additional forensic verification, but the video evidence alone was sufficient to establish criminal conspiracy. "The premeditation element is crucial here," Detective Park explained to Madison and her parents. "These recordings show that Ashley Morrison and her associates planned to cause you physical harm specifically because they viewed you as vulnerable due to your disability. That transforms simple assault into a hate crime with much more serious consequences." While Detective Park conducted her preliminary interviews, a second development was unfolding that would amplify the case far beyond anyone's expectations. Jake Torres had been quietly working his cybersecurity contacts throughout the afternoon, and his efforts had caught the attention of Agent Sarah Chun of the FBI Civil Rights Division. Agent Chun specialized in cases involving the systematic harassment of protected groups, particularly in educational settings. Jake's technical documentation of the harassment pattern, combined with the evidence of targeting multiple disabled students, had triggered automatic flags in federal databases that monitored hate crime trends. Agent Chun arrived at Riverside High School accompanied by 2 additional FBI agents and a federal prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Their presence immediately elevated the case from a local police matter to a federal investigation with national implications. We have reason to believe this case may be part of a broader pattern of disability-based harassment in educational institutions, Agent Chun announced to the assembled group. The sophisticated planning and coordination evident in these recordings suggests these individuals may have been sharing tactics with similar groups elsewhere. The FBI had been tracking an alarming trend of organized harassment targeting students with disabilities across multiple states. Social media platforms and encrypted messaging apps had enabled groups of young people to share strategies for tormenting vulnerable classmates while avoiding detection by school authorities. Madison's case was significant because her brother's technical expertise had captured evidence that most victims couldn't provide. The detailed documentation of planning, execution, and cover-up provided investigators with a complete picture of how these harassment campaigns operated. Agent Chun reviewed the evidence with Detective Park, noting elements that suggested connections to similar cases in other districts. The specific language used in the text messages, the coordination of timing and witnesses, and the sophisticated understanding of how to exploit administrative blind spots all indicated that Ashley's group might have been following established patterns rather than improvising their own approach. We're going to need to examine all digital communications between these students and their contacts outside the school, Agent Chun informed Principal Stevens. This investigation may extend well beyond Riverside High School. The implications terrified Stevens. A federal investigation would subject the school to intense scrutiny that could reveal other failures in protecting vulnerable students. More immediately, the media attention would be devastating for the school's reputation and his own career prospects. But Stevens' personal concerns paled in comparison to what was happening to the students involved in the harassment. FBI agents were simultaneously executing search warrants at the homes of Ashley Morrison, Brittany Walsh, and Jessica Chun, seizing computers, phones, and other digital devices that might contain evidence of criminal conspiracy. Ashley Morrison was in her bedroom working on homework when agents knocked on the door of her family's sprawling colonial home in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood. Her father, attorney David Morrison, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation and contacted his law firm's criminal defense partners. The contrast between Ashley's privileged background and Madison's working-class family would become a significant element in the public perception of the case. Ashley's parents had donated thousands of dollars to school fundraisers and political campaigns, expecting their financial influence to protect their daughter from serious consequences for her actions. Brittany Walsh's family reacted with denial and blame shifting that would characterize their response throughout the investigation. Her mother, real estate developer Patricia Walsh, immediately called Principal Stevens demanding to know why the school had allowed that deaf girl to record her daughter without permission. Jessica Chun's parents took a different approach, recognizing the severity of the evidence and beginning discussions with prosecutors about potential cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Their willingness to acknowledge their daughter's wrongdoing would ultimately prove beneficial when sentencing recommendations were made. The federal investigation moved with a speed and thoroughness that shocked the local community. Within 48 hours, agents had reconstructed the complete timeline of harassment, identified additional victims, and uncovered digital evidence connecting the Riverside group to similar harassment campaigns in 3 other states. The most disturbing discovery came from Ashley Morrison's laptop, which contained detailed profiles of students with disabilities at the school, including photographs, personal information, and notes about their specific vulnerabilities. The files read like a predator's hunting guide, complete with strategies for psychological manipulation and physical intimidation. Agent Sheehan found similar databases on the other suspects' devices, suggesting a level of organization and premeditation that went far beyond typical teenage bullying. The girls had been conducting systematic surveillance of vulnerable students, documenting their routines, identifying when they were most isolated, and planning attacks designed to cause maximum psychological trauma. "This isn't bullying," Agent Chun told the assembled investigators. "This is organized persecution that meets the legal definition of domestic terrorism targeting individuals with disabilities." The terrorism designation would prove controversial, but legally defensible. The suspects had used threats, intimidation, and violence to target individuals based on their membership in a protected class, with the specific intent of creating fear and submission among the broader population of disabled students. Madison's brave decision to document the harassment had exposed a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond her own victimization. Other students at Riverside High School began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation, many involving the same group of perpetrators. The investigation revealed that Ashley's group had been operating for over 2 years, gradually escalating their tactics as they became more confident in their ability to avoid consequences. Madison hadn't been their first victim, she had been their most recent target in a pattern of systematic abuse that had driven several other students to transfer schools or drop out entirely. Dr. Martinez found herself coordinating with federal investigators to identify all students who might have been targeted, providing academic records that showed suspicious patterns of declining performance, increased absences, and requests for transfers that might indicate unreported harassment. The scope of the investigation continued to expand as digital forensics experts uncovered evidence of coordination with similar groups in other school districts. Ashley Morrison's social media accounts revealed connections to young people across the country who shared strategies for targeting students with disabilities while avoiding detection by authorities. But perhaps the most significant development came when Agent Chun discovered that Ashley's group had been planning to escalate their activities beyond individual harassment to what they called disability awareness events, public humiliations designed to terrorize the entire disabled student population at Riverside High School. The plans, found in encrypted files on Brittany Walsh's computer, detailed a coordinated attack during the school's upcoming homecoming assembly, where they intended to subject multiple disabled students to simultaneous public humiliation while recording the events for distribution online. Madison's courage in documenting the harassment had not only protected herself, it had prevented a mass harassment event that could have traumatized dozens of vulnerable students and potentially inspired copycat attacks in other schools. As news of the federal investigation leaked to local media, Riverside High School found itself at the center of a national conversation about disability rights, school safety, and the responsibility of educational institutions to protect their most vulnerable students. Madison Torres, the quiet 17-year-old who had simply wanted to attend chemistry class without fear, had inadvertently become the catalyst for a federal civil rights investigation that would reshape how schools across the country address harassment targeting students with disabilities. The FBI's Digital Forensics Lab in Quantico, Virginia had processed thousands of cybercrime cases, but the evidence recovered from the Riverside High School investigation revealed something unprecedented. A sophisticated network of harassment groups operating across 17 states, all targeting students with disabilities through coordinated campaigns of psychological warfare. Agent Sarah Chun stood before a wall-mounted display showing connection maps between dozens of suspects when she received the call that would transform Madison Torres' case from a local harassment incident into a landmark federal prosecution. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, a 16-year-old cybersecurity prodigy named Marcus Williams from Portland, Oregon, who had been documenting similar harassment at his own school. Marcus had disabilities himself. He was autistic with severe social anxiety, but his exceptional computer skills had allowed him to penetrate the encrypted networks that the harassment groups used to coordinate their activities. What he discovered was a virtual academy where experienced bullies taught newcomers how to systematically destroy the lives of vulnerable students while maintaining plausible deniability. They call themselves the Silent Storm Network, Marcus explained to Agent Chun during the secure video conference. His parents flanked him on either side, providing support as he described months of undercover work infiltrating the group's digital communications. They have detailed training modules, target assessment protocols, and even legal advice on avoiding prosecution. The Silent Storm Network operated with the organizational sophistication of a professional intelligence operation. New members underwent screening processes to ensure they weren't law enforcement infiltrators. Experienced operators mentored newcomers through escalating campaigns of harassment. Most disturbing of all, they maintained detailed databases of successful attacks that could be replicated in other locations. Agent Chun realized that Ashley Morrison and her associates at Riverside High School weren't independent actors. They were part of a nationwide conspiracy that had been systematically terrorizing students with disabilities for over 3 years. The evidence Madison had collected wasn't just documentation of local crimes. It was a window into a criminal enterprise that spanned the entire country. The network's digital infrastructure was remarkably sophisticated. They used encrypted messaging apps with self-destructing messages, virtual private networks to mask their locations, and cryptocurrency payments to fund their activities. Most members never met in person, communicating only through carefully secured digital channels that they believed were undetectable by authorities. But Marcus Williams had found a vulnerability in their security protocols. His autism gave him an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in digital communications, and he had identified recurring language structures and timing patterns that allowed him to map the network's organization and hierarchy. Ashley Morrison is what they call a regional coordinator, Marcus explained. She's responsible for recruiting and training new cells in her geographic area. The Riverside group wasn't just harassing Madison, they were preparing to establish training programs for groups in other Connecticut schools. The implications staggered Agent Chun. If the network had successfully established training programs in Connecticut, similar efforts were likely underway in other states. The potential scope of victimization could involve thousands of vulnerable students across the country. Federal prosecutors immediately recognized the magnitude of what they were facing. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Rodriguez, who specialized in civil rights prosecutions, took personal control of the case and began coordinating with U.S. attorneys' offices in 16 other states where network activity had been identified. This represents the largest conspiracy to violate the civil rights of individuals with disabilities in U.S. history. Rodriguez announced during a press conference that would make Madison Torres' story national news. "We're dealing with a criminal organization that has systematically targeted our most vulnerable young people for terrorism and psychological warfare." The terrorism designation was legally significant, but also controversial. Critics argued that applying terrorism statutes to teenage harassment trivialized genuine national security threats. However, federal prosecutors maintained that the systematic nature of the conspiracy, its interstate scope, and its deliberate targeting of protected groups met the legal definition of domestic terrorism. Madison found herself at the center of a media storm she never wanted or expected. Her quiet strength in the face of harassment had exposed a criminal conspiracy, but the attention brought new challenges and unexpected dangers. The Silent Storm Network had protocols for dealing with members who were exposed, and Madison's prominent role in the investigation made her a target for retaliation. FBI security specialists conducted a threat assessment of Madison and her family, concluding that protective measures were necessary. The Torres family was relocated to a secure location while agents investigated specific threats that had been posted on dark web forums associated with the harassment network. They're calling for coordinated attacks on Madison and other victims who have spoken out, Agent Chun explained to Madison's parents during a briefing at a federal safe house. These threats are credible and detailed enough that we have to take them seriously. The retaliation campaign revealed another layer of the network's sophistication. They had developed specific protocols for punishing members who cooperated with law enforcement and victims who exposed their activities. The threats against Madison included plans for doxing her family, distributing deepfake videos designed to humiliate her, and coordinating physical attacks at any location where she might appear publicly. But the network's response to Madison's case also provided investigators with additional evidence of their criminal activities. The threatening communications were traced back to network leadership figures who had previously remained hidden behind layers of digital anonymity. Dr. Angela Martinez found herself coordinating with federal investigators to assess the scope of harassment in educational institutions across Connecticut. The investigation had revealed that the Riverside High School group had been in contact with similar cells in Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, suggesting that the network had successfully penetrated multiple school districts in the state. We're identifying victims who never reported their harassment because they didn't believe anyone would help them, Dr. Martinez explained during a meeting with state education officials. The network specifically targeted students who were isolated, had limited family support, or attended schools with poor records of addressing harassment complaints. The victim identification process was heartbreaking but necessary. Federal investigators worked with disability rights organizations to locate students who had been targeted by network members, many of whom had suffered in silence for months or years without understanding that their harassment was part of a coordinated conspiracy. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from the network's training materials, which included detailed psychological profiles of different disability types and specific strategies for exploiting the unique vulnerabilities associated with each condition. Students with autism were targeted differently than students with hearing impairments, who were targeted differently than students with mobility limitations. Madison's case had been particularly valuable to the network because it demonstrated effective techniques for harassing deaf students. The training materials included detailed analysis of her harassment, complete with video clips and recommendations for replicating similar attacks in other locations. Agent Chun realized that Madison's courage in documenting her harassment had done more than protect herself. It had provided law enforcement with a comprehensive guide to the network's operational methods. Every technique they had used against Madison was documented and being taught to other network members. But now federal investigators understood exactly how the system worked. The legal strategy for prosecuting the conspiracy required careful coordination between multiple jurisdictions. Each state where network activity had been identified would file charges against local participants, while federal prosecutors would focus on the leadership figures who had coordinated activities across state lines. Ashley Morrison's role as a regional coordinator made her a high-priority target for federal prosecution. The evidence recovered from her devices showed that she had been in contact with network leadership figures and had received specific training on recruitment, operational security, and target assessment. Her prosecution would send a clear message that leadership roles in the conspiracy carried severe consequences. The network's reaction to the federal investigation revealed the extent of their paranoia and sophistication. Communications intercepts showed panic among leadership figures as they realized the scope of law enforcement penetration into their organization. Many began destroying evidence and attempting to flee to countries without extradition treaties with the Ken Treaties with the United States. But the investigation had reached a tipping point where the evidence was overwhelming and the network's ability to protect its members was crumbling. Marcus Williams' infiltration had provided investigators with access to leadership communications that revealed the identities and locations of key figures who had previously operated with complete anonymity. Madison Torres, meanwhile, was slowly adjusting to her new reality as the primary witness in a federal conspiracy prosecution. The shy 17-year-old who had simply wanted to attend chemistry class without fear had become a symbol of resistance against organized hatred targeting individuals with disabilities. Her testimony would be crucial in establishing the systematic nature of the harassment and the deliberate targeting of disabled students. But more importantly, her courage in documenting the abuse had exposed a criminal conspiracy that might have continued operating for years, destroying the lives of countless vulnerable young people across the country. The Silent Storm Network's reign of terror was coming to an end, but the legal proceedings that would bring its members to justice were just beginning. Madison's case would become the foundation for a prosecution that would reshape how law enforcement addresses organized harassment, targeting protected groups, and establish precedents that would protect vulnerable students for generations to come. 18 months after Madison Torres first activated her hidden recording device in chemistry class, she stood before the United States District Court in Hartford, Connecticut, preparing to deliver victim impact testimony that would conclude the largest disability rights prosecution in American history. The shy 17-year-old who had once struggled to speak up in class had become the voice for thousands of vulnerable students across the nation. The prosecution of the Silent Storm Network had resulted in federal convictions in 12 states, with over 60 individuals receiving sentences ranging from juvenile detention to 15 years in federal prison. Ashley Morrison, now 19, and facing adult charges as the Connecticut Regional Coordinator, sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit that marked her transformation from privileged high school queen to federal prisoner. Judge Patricia Yamamoto had presided over the complex multi-defendant trial with the gravitas befitting a case that had captured national attention and established new legal precedents for prosecuting organized harassment campaigns. The courtroom was packed with victims, families, disability rights advocates, and media representatives who understood they were witnessing a landmark moment in civil rights history. "Miss Torres," Judge Yamamoto said gently, "the court is ready to hear your statement." Madison approached the witness stand with the quiet confidence she had developed through months of therapy and advocacy work. Mrs. Coleman, her faithful interpreter, positioned herself where both Madison and the judge could see her clearly. The same woman who had stood by Madison during her darkest moments would now help her deliver testimony that would shape federal sentencing guidelines for decades to come. "Your Honor," Madison began, her hands moving with practiced precision. As Mrs. Coleman voiced her words, "When I first started recording the harassment one experienced at Riverside High School, I thought I was simply protecting myself from bullies. I never imagined that my decision would expose a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized students with disabilities across the entire country." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Madison described the psychological warfare she had endured, the systematic attempts to destroy her academic performance and self-worth, and the escalating violence that culminated in the chemical attack that had triggered the federal investigation. "The evidence shows that I was never the real target," Madison continued. "I was a test case, a training exercise for people who viewed students with disabilities as objects to be tormented for entertainment. The defendants didn't see me as a human being with hopes, dreams, and the right to pursue my education in safety. They saw me as a vulnerability to be exploited." Ashley Morrison's parents sat in the gallery, their faces etched with the shame and disbelief that had consumed them since learning the true extent of their daughter's crimes. David Morrison, the successful attorney who had once threatened to sue the school district for suspending his daughter, now faced the reality that his legal expertise was powerless to protect Ashley from the consequences of her choices. The investigation had revealed that Ashley's transformation from typical teenager to criminal coordinator hadn't happened overnight. Digital forensics experts had traced her involvement with the Silent Storm network back over 2 years, showing a gradual escalation from consuming hateful content online to actively recruiting and training other young people to commit similar crimes. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Ashley during the legal proceedings, testified that the defendant showed classic signs of radicalization, similar to patterns observed in other forms of domestic terrorism. The network had systematically desensitized its members to the humanity of their victims, while providing social reinforcement for increasingly extreme behavior. Miss Morrison didn't become a terrorist overnight, Dr. Walsh explained to the court. She was recruited, trained, and gradually conditioned to view violence against individuals with disabilities as acceptable and even praiseworthy. The sophisticated nature of this conditioning makes her particularly dangerous and suggests that rehabilitation will require intensive intervention. The sentencing phase revealed the full scope of the network's impact. Victim after victim testified about harassment campaigns that had destroyed their academic performance, social relationships, and mental health. Some had attempted suicide. Others had dropped out of school entirely. Many would require years of therapy to recover from the psychological trauma inflicted by network members. Marcus Williams, the autistic cybersecurity expert whose infiltration had exposed the network structure, testified via secure video link about the sophisticated recruitment and training processes that had transformed ordinary teenagers into systematic abusers. The Silent Storm network didn't just encourage harassment, Marcus explained. They created a comprehensive system for identifying vulnerable targets, developing personalized attack strategies, and avoiding detection by authorities. They turned cruelty into a science, and they were teaching that science to new recruits. Every day, Judge Yamamoto had studied the evidence extensively, reviewing thousands of pages of digital communications, training materials, and victim testimonies. The systematic nature of the conspiracy, combined with its deliberate targeting of protected groups, placed it in a category of criminal behavior that existing sentencing guidelines hadn't anticipated. This case represents a new form of domestic terrorism that specifically targets our most vulnerable citizens, Judge Yamamoto stated during her sentencing remarks. The defendants created and operated a criminal enterprise designed to deny individuals with disabilities their fundamental right to participate equally in educational opportunities. Ashley Morrison received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with restrictions on internet access and contact with individuals under 18. The sentence was intended to reflect both the seriousness of her leadership role and the need to deter similar criminal enterprises. Brittany Walsh and Jessica Chen, who had cooperated with the investigation and provided testimony against network leadership, received lighter sentences of 4 and 6 years respectively. Their cooperation had been instrumental in identifying other victims and exposing the network's operational methods, but the most significant impact of the prosecution extended far beyond the individual sentences. The case had prompted comprehensive reviews of harassment policies in school districts across the country, with federal education officials issuing new guidelines requiring specific protections for students with disabilities. Madison's brother, Jake, had parlayed his technical expertise in the case into a new career as a cybersecurity consultant, specializing in protecting vulnerable populations from online harassment. His company, Torres Digital Security, had developed monitoring systems that could detect coordinated harassment campaigns before they escalated to violence. Madison's courage didn't just expose one criminal conspiracy, Jake explained during a conference presentation to school administrators. She demonstrated that Victims of systematic harassment can fight back effectively when they have the right tools and support systems. Dr. Angela Martinez had been promoted to State Director of Special Education Services, with a mandate to implement comprehensive anti-harassment programs in every Connecticut school district. The protocols developed in response to Madison's case had become a national model for protecting students with disabilities from organized harassment. We learned that traditional anti-bullying programs were completely inadequate for addressing sophisticated criminal conspiracies, Dr. Martinez explained to a congressional committee investigating the case. We needed to develop new approaches that recognized the systematic nature of these attacks and provided victims with the resources they needed to document and report abuse effectively. Principal Robert Stevens had resigned from Riverside High School and left education entirely, unable to reconcile his failure to protect Madison with his professional responsibilities. His replacement, Dr. Maria Santos, had implemented comprehensive reforms that transformed the school's culture and made it a national leader in disability inclusion. Madison Torres taught us that students with disabilities aren't just entitled to accommodation, they're entitled to justice, Dr. Santos said during a ceremony honoring Madison's courage, her willingness to document abuse and pursue legal remedies has created a safer environment for every vulnerable student in America. Madison herself had used the settlement money from her civil lawsuit against the school district to establish a scholarship fund for students with disabilities, pursuing careers in law enforcement, cybersecurity, and civil rights advocacy. The Madison Torres Foundation had already supported dozens of young people who were working to prevent others from experiencing the systematic harassment she had endured, now 18 and attending Georgetown University on a full academic scholarship. Madison had chosen to study law with the intention of becoming a federal prosecutor, specializing in civil rights cases. Her experience as both victim and key witness in a landmark prosecution had given her unique insights into how the legal system could be used to protect vulnerable populations. I never wanted to become a symbol or a public figure, Madison reflected. During her final court appearance, I just wanted to attend school without fear. But I've learned that sometimes individual courage can create systemic change that protects countless other people who are facing similar threats. The Silent Storm Network had been completely dismantled, its leadership imprisoned, and its operational methods exposed to law enforcement agencies worldwide. Similar networks had been identified and prosecuted in other countries, creating an international precedent for addressing organized harassment targeting individuals with disabilities. Madison Torres had transformed from victim to victor, from silent sufferer to powerful advocate, from isolated teenager to national symbol of resistance against organized hatred. Her hidden camera had captured more than evidence of crime. It had documented the resilience of the human spirit and the power of individual courage to create lasting change. The 17 seconds of footage that started everything had become a catalyst for a revolution in how society protects its most vulnerable members, ensuring that Madison's suffering would prevent countless others from experiencing similar abuse. Her story would be studied in law schools, referenced in court cases, and remembered as a turning point in the fight for disability rights in America. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.